What was? What did immigration used to look like in America? We kicked off the last segment. We hear all the time that we're a nation of immigrants. Is that true?
Well, we are definitely a nation of immigrants. This is a country that started without any real immigration laws at all. And in fact, the first Immigration Act, if you want to call it that, was the Alien and Sedition Act, which was passed under the Adams administration. But largely up until the late 19th century, immigrants were allowed to come into the United States and become citizens of the United States through some, rather convoluted processes pretty freely. That all changed in the 1890s. There were some restrictive laws which were race-based. I'm not going to lie to you about that. The Chinese Exclusion Acts were the earliest, true immigration laws as you think about it, and those continued well into the 1940s. We saw a huge increase in immigration in the 1890s, 1910s, up until the First World War. In 1924, Congress decided to crack down on immigration and pass what was called the 1924 Immigration Act, not very original. But that limited the ability of nationals coming from outside the Western Hemisphere to enter, and it set a percentage based upon the percentage that various nationals were in the United States Census in 1890. And that continued more or less unabated until 1965, when there was another Immigration Act. This one opened up immigration. It was part of the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s. And that's what's really led to this massive surge in immigration that we see today, because it allowed people to petition for their relatives to come to the United States, settle here with green cards, become citizens, and live here. So, we've seen the proportion of people who are foreign born go from about 14.7% in the 1910s. It dipped down to about 5% in the 1960s, and now we're up above 15%. So we actually have a larger proportion of foreign-born folks in the United States right now than we ever have at any point in our history.
Wow, I shared that 14% line in the opening segment, but I didn't even think about what it is today. So it's even higher now than it was then. What was the first year you sort of stated there when a law went into effect? You say like 1910 or so? Was that the year you mentioned?
So yeah, in the 1880s, there was a huge concern. There was a nativist movement in California, and there was a concern about Chinese nationals who were coming into California to work, that they were taking jobs away from native Californians, many of whom were immigrants themselves. And so that is when they instituted the Chinese Exclusion Act. But 1924 was really the first time that there was a nationwide crackdown on free immigration to the United States, particularly from Europe. And a lot of that was triggered by events following the First World War, anarchist attacks in the United States and things like that, and concerns about the ability of the United States to assimilate this large number of people that we have. And actually, it did give a pause. It did allow us to assimilate people here in the country. But it's also important to note, Mike, that immigration from the Western Hemisphere at that time was free. There weren't the restrictions we had in Europe and Asia. But, the number of people coming from, Mexico, South America really wasn't that large. That didn't really start until the early 1970s and, well into the 80s. It peaked under Clinton, went down after September 11th, and now we saw a brand new peak that exceeded all previous numbers under the Biden administration coming illegally over the southwest border.
That's really interesting. Do you have any insight into why? Because it would be easier back in, let's say, 1920 to come from Mexico than it would be to come from Europe, take that long journey on a boat. Why did it take until the 70s to get that peak in Latin America?
Yeah, and, that is actually a very interesting question. A lot of it had to do with the fact that most of northern Mexico really wasn't populated. People lived in Veracruz and Mexico City, of course, and in southern Mexico, but you just really didn't have that many people living along the border. And people who did live along the border would, more or less come and go freely. There wasn't really a lot of restrictions, and so they didn't feel the need to enter illegally. But, beginning in the Eisenhower administration, the INS started to crack down on people coming illegally. But to give you an idea, Mike, the first year for which we actually have Southwest border apprehension numbers was FY 1960 in the Eisenhower administration, and they apprehended just over 22,000 people that entire year. So it really wasn't until, the lure of jobs in the United States, economic downturns in Mexico, really drove people from Mexico to the United States. It's also important to remember that up until about 2007, about 95% of all the people that came illegally to the United States were from Mexico. They were, coming to work, and they were probably going to go back. It was only in 2014 that we saw the number of people coming illegally from Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, surpass the number of people entering the United States illegally from Mexico. And now, as you know, we're seeing people coming from all over the world, Africa, Asia, Europe, coming to that southwest border.
And going back probably is not in their plan.
Yeah.
So what if you were an Irish fella back in 1920, what was it like legally to come here? Or was there even a legal or illegal? Like, how did you get here and what were the rules?
Yeah, after the 1924 Act, you actually had to petition in order to come to the United States. A lot of people do genealogy and they, go back to Ellis Island, and what they find are the documents, those organic documents, are actually ship's manifests. The captain of the ship would give the manifest to the port inspector, and the port inspector would check everybody on the list. But beginning in the 1920s, there was a formal process that you had to go through that involved Washington, D.C., or your local consulate to enable you to come here. And a number of people, still continue to come here. We saw a large wave of Irish and Greek or Italian and Greek immigration in that time, and a lot of people petitioned for their relatives abroad to come here. So immigration never ended, but it definitely was curbed for a number of decades.
What about before that, 1910 or so? You could just come and step off the boat and you're here?
Yeah. In fact, it's curious because in order to come today to work, you have to have an employer who's, going to give you a job. Back then, it was completely the opposite. If you had an employer who was going to give you a job, you would be barred from entering the United States. And in fact, I'm not going to throw my great-grandfather, for whom I'm named, under the bus, but that's exactly how he came here. He had a job in Pennsylvania, and he claimed that he was going to Cleveland, Ohio. He never went to Cleveland, Ohio in his life.
Well, I understand. Why do they have a law that says if you have a job, you can't come here?
Because the concern was, and this was at the beginning of the labor movement, the union movement, they didn't want people coming to take jobs that were available in the United States that could be filled by American workers. And, that brings up another important point. Up until, the late 1990s and well into the 2000s, the labor movement primarily sponsored or promoted immigration enforcement laws. In fact, Cesar Chavez, famously attempted to keep people, illegal aliens from Mexico, from coming into the United States to take farm worker jobs. That really only changed in the last 10 to 15 years, where the labor movement is now calling for a legalization of the people who are here illegally, largely because many of them are union workers. So, immigration makes strange bedfellows just like politics does, and dance partners change all the time.
Talk to me about the immigrant experience itself. So if you're an Irish person coming off the boat in 1910, how is that different than a Venezuelan getting off the airplane at JFK today?
Significantly different. If you were an Irishman coming to the United States and you had family, you generally went to where that family is, which is why we see, huge Irish populations, concentrations in towns like Boston, Savannah, even Baltimore, where, people would go to when they would stay. There was no safety net. There was no welfare. If you were an Irishman, generally what you did was you got support from the Catholic Church if you were Catholic, or from the Presbyterian or Church of Ireland if you were one of those faiths, and those people provided for you. But the really interesting thing is it had a huge effect on local politics. So if you were an Irishman coming to the United States, there were Irish politicians who got elected, in many northern cities. And they would, if they could, provide you with a job. That's why, again, there are so many Irish police officers and Irish firefighters, because those were jobs that were political jobs that the local, Irish boss could give to you. And that's how you provided for yourself. If you're a Venezuelan coming to the United States today and you end up in New York City, the Catholic Church, will try to provide for you. But the most of the support that you're going to get is from the city of New York itself, which is why, it's up around $5 billion that they're projecting they're going to pay for the migrants who have come here. So, and New York has taken that upon themselves, but that itself, Mike, creates a magnet. It draws people to the United States. If you're going to pay $7,000 to a smuggler and that's all the money you have, you don't really worry about it because you know that once you get to the United States, you're going to get transportation, you're going to get a place to live, you're going to get food, and you're going to get English language training and put on the path to a job. So, again, we are a humanitarian people. We are a nation of immigrants, and we all have, those rose-colored, misty memories of our past. But, that past was a world in which we didn't have, welfare. Now we do have welfare. And as Milton Friedman said, open immigration and a welfare state are incompatible. And we definitely see the late great economist's wisdom coming to the fore right now.
That's right. I got about 30 seconds for this last question. What do you make of the argument like, oh, you conservatives, you guys are making a big deal about nothing. We've had all these periods in our history that we've been speaking of here that everyone was all worried about, Irish need not apply, et cetera. And it all worked out. And now we have St. Patrick's Day and we like tacos and this is no different than that and just get over it. What do you say to that?
Well, again, with respect to that, times change, things change. We are in uncharted territories. As I noted at the outset, we now have the largest percentage of foreign-born people in the United States. And it's absolutely crucial if anybody who comes here, that they be able to provide for themselves, which is actually what the legal immigration system does. If you come to the United States, you either have to have a job or a relative who can sponsor you. Right now, we're talking about 5 million people who have entered the United States illegally since Joe Biden took office. We don't have housing for 5 billion people. We don't have the medical system that can provide for it. It's putting a huge strain on the education system. It's best to return to the limits that Congress set, ensure people can care for themselves, and that they can build and contribute to this country so we can continue to be a country of immigrants. But if I may very briefly say, the biggest concern is one that was voiced by Barbara Jordan, former congressman from Houston, big civil rights advocate back in the 1990s. She said, if we can't control illegal immigration, I fear that Americans will lose faith in legal immigration. And in poll after poll that we see, that's exactly what's happening today.
Oh, very interesting. Andrew Arthur, resident fellow in law and policy for the Center for Immigration Studies. Andrew, great to talk to you. Thank you, sir.